On screen, I'm showing you a summary that should make the difference between the governing body's previous position and the new one regarding the use of blood crystal clear. Under the previous position, a Jehovah's Witness was not allowed to store their own blood for the purpose of later receiving a transfusion of that same blood. However, it was allowed for that blood to enter a closed artificial circulatory system in order to be medically treated. Under the new position, both practices are now permitted. A witness can now, if they choose, both store their own blood for a later transfusion and allow it to enter a closed artificial circulatory system for medical treatment. Having analyzed the issue, several important questions remain. What real difference is there between receiving someone else's blood and receiving your own? Isn't this a contradiction of their own doctrine? Does this authorization mean that in practice, no more Jehovah's Witnesses will die from refusing blood transfusions? What about Jehovah's Witnesses, including children, who died because of the previous policy? Do these changes mean that someday witnesses will accept all types of blood transfusions? And what does the Bible actually say about this? I'm sure that you, just like me, have mixed feelings about this change in the governing body's policies. On the one hand, I welcome the change. Not for me, of course, but because some Jehovah's Witnesses, human beings after all, will avoid dying by receiving a transfusion of their own blood. But at the same time, I cannot help but feel deep regret for those in the past who could have saved their lives using this very procedure, and didn't, simply because the governing body considered it a sin against God. I also cannot ignore the fact that these kinds of procedures are far from cheap. Many witnesses will not have access to them, not because their conscience prevents them, but because they lack medical insurance, the necessary financial resources, or because, even if they do have insurance, it may not cover this type of procedure. On the other hand, these procedures can be very useful in specific cases, such as scheduled surgeries, but the idea that someone would store their blood just in case they might need it in an emergency is simply not very sensible. First, because it is extremely expensive. And second, because no one can guarantee that they will have an accident anywhere near the place where their own blood is being stored. The only real, permanent, and truly acceptable solution to this problem would be for the governing body to authorize all types of blood transfusions, both those involving a person's own blood and those involving blood from another individual. And I can already see many Jehovah's Witnesses downplaying the issue, just as they have done all their lives, saying, in reality, it doesn't matter if someone died under the previous policy. By dying faithful to Jehovah, they will be resurrected and live forever. In my opinion, and I'm sure in the opinion of many of you, that kind of reasoning is nothing more than self-deception. On the one hand, it depends on a whole series of assumptions, among them that Jehovah's Witnesses are truly the one true religion. No one should stake their life, or the life of their loved ones, on such a risky and, in my opinion, mistaken assumption. On the other hand, it is a line of reasoning that minimizes the value of human life. It closely resembles the logic used by those who tortured and executed supposed heretics or witches under the belief that they were saving their souls. And then there's this. Even if this change may benefit some Jehovah's Witnesses, it still amounts to a mockery, even of their own beliefs. What real difference is there between receiving someone else's blood and receiving your own? To me, it feels like a complete farce. And finally, it is deeply troubling that, according to Jehovah's Witnesses, up until March 19th, it was Jehovah's will for his followers to reject transfusions of their own blood, even at the cost of their lives. But that on March 20th, Jehovah's will suddenly became the opposite. Is anyone going to take responsibility for the lives sacrificed based on a biblical interpretation that changes as quickly as a weather vane? Now, let's take a look at what the Bible actually says about this issue. While it is true that in the book of Acts, chapter 15, the instruction to abstain from blood is mentioned, it is clear that blood transfusions did not exist in apostolic times. Therefore, the admonition specifically refers to not eating blood. So, just as Garrett Lush states in the video we are analyzing, that the Bible says nothing about the use of one's own blood, we could also say that it says nothing about transfusions. On the other hand, when we examine the scriptures, it becomes clear that there is no biblical basis for taking this issue to the extreme of costing people their lives. This becomes evident when we read 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 25 through 27. Eat whatever is sold in a meat market, making no inquiry because of your conscience, for to Jehovah belong the earth and everything in it. If an unbeliever invites you and you want to go, eat whatever is set before you, making no inquiry on account of your conscience. In the verses we just read, Paul has no hesitation in saying that Christians can eat anything sold in the marketplace or anything offered to them by an unbeliever, without asking questions for the sake of their conscience. What kind of questions is he referring to? Placing ourselves in the first century context, the questions a believer might ask would be, was the meat being sold in the marketplace or served in the home of an unbeliever, offered to an idol? Was it properly drained of blood? This last question would be relevant because eating meat that has not been properly drained is, in effect, eating meat with its blood. However, it is clear that Paul is saying that no Christian should be overly concerned about such matters. It is clear, then, that the Apostle Paul did not believe that the command to abstain from blood should be taken to such extremes. Now, let's read Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And look, a woman was there who had had a spirit of weakness for 18 years, and she was bent double and was unable to straighten up at all. When he saw her, Jesus addressed her and said, "Woman, you are released from your weakness." And he laid his hands on her, and instantly she straightened up and began to glorify God. But in response, the presiding officer of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus did the cure on the Sabbath, said to the crowd, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done, so come and be cured on those days, and not on the Sabbath day." However, the Lord answered him, "Hypocrites, does not each one of you on the Sabbath untie his bull or his donkey from the stall and lead it away to give it something to drink? Should not this woman, who is a daughter of Abraham and whom Satan held bound for 18 years, be released from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" Well, when he said these things, all his opposers began to feel shame, but the entire crowd began to rejoice at all the glorious things he did. Let's remember that when Jesus spoke these words, the Mosaic law was still in force. According to the Scriptures, the Mosaic law came to an end when Jesus died. Therefore, at the time Jesus said this, keeping the Sabbath was still a binding command. However, Jesus made it clear that this command should not be taken to such an extreme that it would prevent healing a woman who had been suffering for 18 years. So both 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verses 25 through 27 and Luke chapter 13 verses 10 through 17 lead us to the same conclusion. The command to abstain from blood, and in fact, any biblical command, should not be taken to extremes. And as we begin to wrap up this video, one question remains. Will the day come when the governing body authorizes blood transfusions from other people, just as they have already authorized transfusions using one's own blood? Well, judging by how confidently they can say one day that God commands something, and the next day that God commands the opposite, I wouldn't be surprised if that day eventually comes. After all, their followers accept everything they say without question. And if that day does come, I will be glad for the many Jehovah's Witnesses who will no longer die because of these absurd interpretations. But at the same time, I will not stop feeling indignation for the hundreds of people, including children, who have lost their lives for following the interpretations of men. The attitude of the governing body reminds me of the words of Donald Trump, when he said that he could stand in the middle of New York and shoot someone, and still not lose the support of his loyal followers. The same thing happens with the governing body. No matter what they say or do, their followers accept it all. If you're interested in discovering what the Bible really says about other absurd doctrines of Jehovah's Witnesses, click on the video in the top right corner. See you there.